Hi, everybody, and welcome to Make It Personal, cutting through the spam to make real connections. The purpose of this webinar is to identify successful ways of making meaningful, personal connections and relationships. So throughout this webinar, we have a couple of goals. The first is to acknowledge current engagement practices that may interfere with meaningful connections. Then, we want to learn and talk about basic characteristics that aid in relationship building. And finally, we want to learn best practices for improving your personal connections and relationships. My name is Kate Shipley. I'm the Alumni Engagement Coordinator at Kappa Headquarters. On the screen, you should be able to see my email address. So if you have any questions about this webinar, questions about making personal connections, or just on the topic, or you're looking for materials, or if you just have questions or need information about connecting with Kappa, feel free to send me an email and I will hook you up. First, let's start by talking about the fact that we live in the age of options. So we live in a world of immediacy that technology and social media has made possible. There is always another option at your fingertips. There's always another way to connect, a better way to connect, a faster way to connect. And those are all right there in your hands or on your computer in front of your face, or now even in our cars. Immediacy, instant gratification, and short attention spans, they govern much of our communication and how we talk to one another, or how we text with one another or write one another. This isn't a defect just of younger generations. It's not even a defect of younger generations. Instead, it's a result of the way that communication, advertising, and messaging are now performed. So all of these things are now done intimately on our personal screens that are so often underneath our pillows at night when we go to sleep. Now, the Billboard 100 song, There's Nothing Holding Me Back by Shawn Mendes is a great anecdote for what we see in these generational shifts. Younger generations don't share a sense of obligation to a cause, so they rarely participate just because it's expected or because it's what we do. So when we think about the silent generation or the greatest generation of Kappas and the idea that they might join an association or do something, well, because I'm a Kappa and that's what Kappas do. That's not how this generation is engaging. That's not how they're connecting, and that's not the same thing that they believe. This new generation, and I should include two probably in that being the millennial generation and Gen Z, they feel as if there's nothing holding them back from doing what they want to do, and they're going to do it. They look for meaning-making or for professional and personal advantages to be had in whatever opportunity or activity they choose. So if you take a look at this HighEnd advertisement here, we can think about the ways in which we consume information. It's easy, it's fast, it's bright, it's fun, and it's attention grabbing. You can tell right away from this advertisement and this big pile of fries that HighEnd wants you to go grab ketchup for your fries. Similarly, often what gets the most engagement is content that makes us stop and content that allows us to picture ourselves in that situation. So we see a lot of images like the one that you're seeing on the screen where you don't necessarily see someone's face, but you see a really striking image or landscape so that you can picture yourself in that position, and it really grabs your attention and gets you to keep looking. Now, the images and content that are interacted with most can be considered best case scenarios. These are the best version of ourselves, and while beauty and perfection and attention-grabbing tactics are great for building a brand, they're not really the best way to make meaningful connections. Putting forward our best images with filters and clever captions and photos that are always smiling, those don't inspire connection. Rather, they inspire enviability and they inspire likes on our pages, and it makes us feel good, but it's not really helping us to connect with other people. And in fact, studies are starting to show that this kind of connection, this perfect ideal of what people put forward on social media and their digital personas is actually very harmful to the way that we view ourselves. And we're starting to see, with students particularly, that this can actually be pretty dangerous. So just moving forward, as you think about making connections with people, we're going to talk a little bit more about how do we connect with the real person and not just that digital persona that we're putting forward. So companies try to grab our attention in a couple of ways, and you can see on the screen there are a couple of things that may or may not be working. I think they're not working, and I'll tell you why in just a minute. But companies are really using these broad, generic, in specific ways of trying to capture audiences. And we actually, as people and members of associations or leaders in our communities, we end up adopting these methods ourselves. And then we turn around and wonder why they're not working. Well, if you think about your spam folder in your email and you think about the tactics that these large companies are working that we see most often, and we maybe think that because that company did it, it's successful. Well, we don't like really getting those emails, do we? Or we don't like having all that spam that we have to go through. So we really want to take a second look when we try to use that in our own everyday lives. Now, you can see here on the screen that these companies are focusing on what they want, not what we want. They send us generic mass communication, and there's often a lack of personal connection. So you can see here at the top of the screen that Amazon is asking me to rate my experience from a purchase that I made. They're asking me to rate that experience because they want to know what that experience was, not because I reached out to them and said, I'd like to give you feedback on your experience, or on my experience with your product, I should say. The middle image there is cut from a Target advertisement selling lunchbox essentials, but I don't even have children, so I'm not sure why I'm getting this advertisement for lunchbox essentials when that's not even something that I would be purchasing. Unless you're someone who just really likes lunchboxes, and I guess people who go to work can take lunchboxes too. But in my case, that was something that I just scrolled right past, and it didn't catch my attention because it didn't have anything to do with my life. And then down below, we've got a letter to Dear University of Pittsburgh student. This person doesn't even have a name. They're just University of Pittsburgh student. And who's going to respond to that email? Now, I do believe, and I think most people would agree, that there is a time and a place to send large-scale communications. And sometimes we have to. But when we're trying to make real, meaningful connections, that's not the time for these tactics. These things actually interfere with our ability to build personal relationships because it's so obvious that it's generic and it's a mass communication. It's not personal. So I think that it's a little bit hypocritical to think that if we're not reaching out in personal ways, for us to think that then people will respond in personal ways. So instead of mimicking these advertising techniques, let's look at the characteristics of those who are already talented relationship builders. Now you can see here on the screen, we've got an image of the Strengths Finder Personal Assessment by Don Clifton. Many companies use Strengths Finder, this psychological quiz, to help their team members identify their personal aptitudes and the strengths that they bring to the table. But although these themes listed might be specific to certain aptitudes, anyone really can mimic the behaviors and thought patterns that are presented here to help them increase skills in those areas. So even if you don't think that you are particularly gifted at being a woo or having empathy or being an includer or a relator, we're going to move into talking about how you can take some of these skills and characteristics and incorporate them into your own personal communication with people so that you can take advantage of these strengths even if they're not perhaps your personal strengths. So let's move on and talk about being a woo. Now, I love talking about being a woo mostly because I think it's a funny word to say, but woo stands for winning others over. And woos believe that there are no strangers. There are only friends that you haven't met yet. Now, I myself am not a woo, but I do try to take some of these things into account when I'm trying to make a personal connection with someone. So people with a strong woo theme in their personality enjoy the challenge of meeting new people, and they're rarely at a loss for words. So if this is you, if you are a woo, take advantage of the ease with which you meet many new people. Not everyone is able to do that, and that's fantastic that you feel comfortable in that space. If this isn't you, try a few techniques from the woo toolkit. Say hello and introduce yourself to as many people as possible in an event. That's the first thing you can try. Second, when you can, find out what people are interested in and talk to them about it. Push yourself to engage with people you don't know and see what kinds of conversations arise. Those are 3 things that you can take from the woo toolkit and add to your own, and I'll repeat them just in case. First is to say hello and introduce yourself to as many people as possible at an event. That's going to really improve your chances of making a connection with someone, just simply by the number of people that you're engaging with. If you only talk to 2 people at an event, you have, I think pretty predictably a very low chance of making new and personal connections. Second, find out what people are interested in and talk to them about it. That will keep them engaged in the conversation, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later in the webinar as well. And then lastly, push yourself to engage with people you don't know and see what kinds of conversations arise. You don't have to steer the conversation. You don't have to know exactly where that conversation is going. Just talk to them about what they like to talk about and hear what they have to say. Let's move on to talking about empathy. This can be a little bit of a tricky one because it's very similar to sympathy, which we'll talk about in just a second. Empathetic people are gifted at understanding where others are coming from and being able to see their viewpoint. They share in others' perspectives. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to agree with a viewpoint or you have to just say whatever you think they want to hear, but your ability to validate someone else's feelings will help you foster trust and connections with them. Now, this doesn't even have to be verbal when we're talking about empathy. It can just be a simple smile or a pat on the shoulder. If you do verbalize your empathy, though, try to acknowledge how the other person feels, where they're coming from, or why they might feel the way that they do. So this can be done as simply as just repeating those words back to someone. So that might sound like, yeah, I see where you're coming from with that. Or, yeah, I think I understand what you mean. Or, I think I feel what you're talking about. I think I can make a connection with that. Just verbalizing that you can put yourself in their shoes can be really helpful to building trust and to helping people feel like they have an honest and genuine connection with you. Now, it's important here as you move forward with empathy to know the difference between empathy and sympathy. And I also think it's important to let other people speak when they know more than I do about something. So right now we're going to listen to and watch a video that's by researcher and storyteller Brené Brown.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no. You want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with "at least." Yeah. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, "I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me." Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
Now, once you feel like you have the difference between sympathy and empathy down, we can go ahead and move forward with inclusion and how to be an includer, even if that's not necessarily one of your first strengths. Includers try to stretch the circle wider. Includers think about who still needs to be reached out to. They don't want anyone to be left out, and they want to make people feel like part of the group. Now, if being an includer is not one of your strengths, that doesn't mean that you're a jerk or that you purposely keep people out. It just means that you're not someone whose first thought is to think about who might also like to be at the table, and that's okay. By recognizing that about yourself, you can kind of start to change that thought pattern, and this tactic can be easily borrowed. So just start thinking about which people or groups of people you have yet to invite to certain events or to include on specific projects or initiatives. It doesn't mean that you have to include everyone you see all willy-nilly, but it does mean that perhaps the circle of stakeholders is widened for the purpose of community building. So when possible, when community building is something that you find important or a priority, think about who else could be at the table, whether or not they would ordinarily be there. This can also be done on a more individual basis by asking people for their input, opinion, and thoughts, especially if they tend to be shy or quiet. Creating space to include others' voices is really just as influential as handing them a physical invitation to a party. If you can show people that you are willing to make space for them at the table, that goes a long way in making them feel welcome and helping them feel comfortable opening up to you. Now, the last characteristic that we can draw on here is the relator. And I myself have the strength of relator, but this is something that you can also do even if you do not. Relators try to learn as much as possible about the people they've met, and they also feel as if the strength of their relationships depends on how much they know about someone and how deep that connection is. Time is a fundamental tool for creating meaningful relationships, and time is specifically important for relators and for people who are trying to adopt some of those relator characteristics. Because relators function best by investing time in the people they meet. So if you're trying to adopt this characteristic, you're going to have to give it some time. Now, this is something in particular that advertising tactics, digital messages, and generic group shares can't compete with. Investing time in relationships that you're trying to cultivate is really important if you want them to be meaningful and lasting. Now, remember that people like to be known, and the only way to get to know another person is to take the time to do that. So if you only have time to send out an email or you only have time to post on Instagram, please do not expect that to turn into a personal connection until you do have the time to put into it. I think that's just the one thing that we can pull from this relator characteristic. in addition to these strengths that you can pull from, even if they aren't your strengths, there are also a couple of themes that we can pull from How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. So the previous personality themes that we just went over may not feel natural to everyone, but anyone can put elements of them into practice. And in 1936, Dale Carnegie wrote the first version of his book here, which you should be seeing on the screen. And the things that he recommends in this book are still applicable. The basic elements of making personal connections hasn't changed. People are still connecting with one another the way that we most always have been. Now, although Carnegie suggests many basic principles in the book, there are 3 that stand out for cutting through the spam that we encounter in relationship building today. The 3 best practices that I'm going to recommend to you in this webinar are listen, show interest, and make others feel important. Now let's talk about listening first. We've already gone over this a little bit, and there are some really great resources out there if you just Google TED Talks and things like that about listening. But once you have asked that person what's important to them and you're trying to have that conversation with people that you don't know, it's really important that you actually listen to what they have to say. This is important because people can tell if you're not listening. If you've ever been in a situation where you're talking about something and someone is either on their phone or doing something else at the same time, think about how that makes you feel. It makes you feel as if what you're saying isn't important, or like they maybe don't have time for it, or they don't care about it. And we want to make sure that we are not that person making people feel that way. We want to make sure that when we ask people a question or when people come to us to share something, we give them our full attention and we actually pay attention to what it is that they have to say. The second thing that Carnegie mentions is showing interest. Now, this goes along with listening, but it should hopefully be really easy if you're actually paying attention and interested in what they have to say. Now, there are lots of things out there that you will find, resources that will tell you, show someone that you're interested in what they have to say by nodding your head and making eye contact and smiling. But if you are actually paying attention and if you are actually interested in what that person has to say, you won't have to use those tactics because it will show that you are interested in what they're talking about. Now, one thing that you can do to go about this and make sure that you're interested in what they have to say is just ask questions. Ask lots of questions and ask them what's important to them and what they find interesting. I think generally you'll find that when people are talking about what's interesting to them, you'll be able to connect and you'll be able to see their passion and hear their passion in their voice, which then should help you learn a little bit and garner some interest in it yourself. The last lesson from Dale Carnegie that we can take away with this is to make others feel important. Now, this is something that is not too difficult to do, but I think is often overlooked. Maya Angelou said that people will forget what you do, but they will never forget how you made them feel. And if you can think about the people that you know who made you feel like you were the only person in the room, or who made you feel like you were special or funny or smart, that's a great feeling, right? So we want to make sure that we are the people who are making others feel that way. Now, there are a couple of ways that you can do this, and it's definitely not by just stroking someone's ego or giving them compliments that are inaccurate. The first is by actually finding out how they are important to something. Now, this goes back to how we asked them what their interests are, what they're involved in, and we actually listened to those answers. If we've done that properly, we should be able to say then, oh, well, it sounds like you have a very important role in XYZ, or you must be an integral part to this project, and then just keep the conversation going. It's all about identifying that person's strengths and being able to articulate that back to them in a way that allows them to feel empowered. And then the last and easiest way that you can make someone feel important is just by using their name. Think about how good you feel when someone remembers your name, when someone uses your name, and then conversely, how bad you feel when someone forgets your name, or how embarrassed you feel when you forget someone's name. So that's probably one of the easiest and most important things that I want to leave you with is use someone's name. Use it when you say hello, use it when you say goodbye, and use it all those areas in between, because I think it's a really easy way to show that not only are you paying attention, but you care about this one individual. Now let's talk really quickly before we end our webinar about some best practices for connection. And you'll see that I have a couple of ideas up here on the screen that you can use yourself, and these are all based on the things and the concepts that we've talked about today. So the first is to make direct appeals. Think back to social media and mass emails and other ways like ads and commercials that companies and large groups try to market to large swaths of people. That generally is not going to work for personal and real connections. So instead, make direct appeals. Speak to that person individually. One of the ways that you can do this is by writing personal, individual emails when possible. Often, if someone can tell it's a mass email, if they can see the 200 people copied on it, or if it doesn't use their name in the opening, they might zone out. They might delete it. They might feel like this doesn't really apply to them. So when possible, be specific and send them an individual email. This isn't always possible, but when it is, try to do that. Third, arrange small group outings. This just provides time for people to get to know one another, and remember that time is one of these really important factors in making personal connections. And then if it's a small group outing, there aren't going to be so many people that it's impossible to really get to know one another on a personal basis. You can also try making personal phone calls. Doing this can really help show that you care, that you're devoting time to them, and that you're willing to talk and you want to listen to and you're interested in hearing what they care about by making that one-on-one call. And then some people say that this has kind of gone by the wayside now because of digital communication, but I really believe in sending handwritten notes. I think the fact that we get less and less mail because so much more of it is digital now means that a handwritten note is really going to stand out. It also shows, again, that you spent the time to write it. And I mean, anymore, what's a stamp? Like 50 cents each? So, I mean, it's not a huge burden on you, but it does mean that you were willing to, depending on the number of notes you wrote, you were willing to put a little bit into it and make a little bit of investment in that person. So go ahead and try these more tangible things to implement some of the concepts and strategies that we spoke to previously. All right, so we're towards the end of our webinar, so I want to make sure that we recap and we go back over everything that we just learned. This webinar identified successful ways of making meaningful, personal connections and relationships, and I hope that you got some good tips and tricks to doing that. We acknowledged current engagement practices that may interfere with meaningful connections. So that goes back to the mass marketing, the total reliance on social media, that sort of thing. Things that aren't personal won't help you make personal connections. We also learned basic characteristics that aid in relationship building. So that's practicing your empathy. That's practicing your inclusion and making sure that people are included. It's also saying hi to more people than you would ordinarily feel comfortable saying hi to. And it's asking people about themselves and truly listening to what they have to say, making them feel important, and using some of those skills like saying their name, which will kind of help you create a rapport with them. And then we also learned best practices for improving your personal connections and relationships. So that goes back to writing those handwritten notes or making personal phone calls, all of those things that were just listed on the last slide. I want to thank you for viewing this webinar and for spending some time with me and talking about how to make personal connections. I think that this is a really important thing that we all need to get better at as we move forward, because no matter how technological and how progressive and savvy our communities become, making personal connections and engaging with one another is still pretty much the same. So I want to make sure that we don't forget how to interact with one another. I think that Making these personal connections can be some of the most fulfilling things that we have with one another. So thank you for listening to this webinar. Again, you have my email address listed on the first couple of slides. So if you have further questions, would like further resources, or if you want to connect with Kappa and find people to practice these techniques on, please just let me know. Again, I'm Kate Shipley. Thank you so much.